Google search tries to get you the results you want. And I guess there's a case that people want to understand what's been said for themselves, and I do think that's probably a freedom of speech argument. I haven't seen the comments, so I can't comment, on that specific case. But in general, there's probably a category of content that should be available so that people can understand it, but you might not want to be prominent.
2/3 of adults in the UK get their news from social media companies, including Facebook and Twitter, search engines such as Google, and apps including Apple News, up from 18% in 2005. Facebook is the third most popular news source in Britain after the BBC and ITV, while among younger teenagers, Instagram, TikTok and YouTube come top. But big tech has been in the news itself recently, possibly for all the wrong reasons, whether that's hate speech, fake news, and governments around the world are taking action. The online safety bill is back in Parliament on Monday. But big tech can also be a force for good. And today, Google is announcing a new UK research and development centre focused on accessible technology. Based here in London, it will, in conjunction with partners like the RNIB, attempt to remove barriers that people with disabilities face. Well, with me here in the studio is Matt Brittin, who's president of Google Europe, to talk about that announcement and some of those wider issues too. Matt, thanks very much for coming into the studio.
Hi, Kathy. Good to be here.
Just tell us, what do you hope this new R&D centre will achieve?
Well, there's a couple of things. There's how can you make the digital world more accessible to people with disabilities, but also what are the ways that technology can help them access the physical world? Great example of that. People may be hard of hearing, and we've now built a tool that's built into an Android phone where you can do live transcription. So literally, as I'm speaking, you'll see the words come up and somebody can read them. And actually, that tool built for people with disabilities has become mainstream because we often like to watch videos with captions with the sound off. And so we're going to be working with partners, as you said, to bring in people with disabilities, put them together with our top engineers and the latest AI to look at how we can do both of those things, better access for the digital world, but also helping people to communicate and access things in the physical world too.
And how much are you spending on this?
Well, the centre we haven't got a number for, but we are, in addition to the centre, making a £1 million investment today as well, which will go three ways. Firstly, it's going to work on a partnership with MenCap, which is about educating young people with learning disabilities about being safer online. Secondly, we're working on research into the barriers that people with disabilities face to help ourselves and others to get better at understanding those things as well. And then some grants around helping people with disabilities get career certificates to help them get jobs in tech. Because one of the things we realise is if you want technology that works for everybody, it actually has to be built by everyone, and that includes people with disabilities.
Yeah. Well, what proportion of your workforce is currently disabled?
Well, it's only around 5 or 6%, but that's a bit difficult because it's based on self-identification, and we know that we need to do better there. And one of the ways we can do better is by partnering with organisations like MenCap, RNIB, RNID to bring together our engineers with people with disabilities. Another thing that we've launched today, which I think is really interesting, is called Project Relate. There are people who have non-standard speech patterns, and in some cases we had somebody we worked with who had cerebral palsy, and only about 10% of the time could they be understood by people they didn't know well. With this app, which they train, that moves to 90% of the time. So think about what that means for somebody with non-standard speech patterns, and there are 250 million of those all around the world. So another example, this is all possible with the latest AI. A couple of years ago, technology wouldn't have been there, so it's real breakthrough stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I love Google Translate for starters. I mean, it's incredible technology. But I mean, would you accept that the, big tech in general can exacerbate inequalities? I'm thinking, for example, AI facial recognition systems often show racial bias. There's been studies to suggest that. Do you accept that premise?
Well, all technology, I think, is neutral. You've got to understand that. And it can be used for good or for bad. And obviously, we work really hard to try to identify how to make sure it's used responsibly, but also to shine a light on where it's used for ill. And so, a good example, actually, skin tone. In the latest Android phones, we've introduced a whole much richer array of skin tones so that the photography actually works better on darker skin colours. We work really hard on things like Google Images to make sure that they're more representative of the population at large, but there's always more work to do. And as I say, one of our mantras, I suppose, at Google is to try to make sure that the people building the technology are representative of the people using the technology. We've got work to do on representation of women in particular in science and technology, but also of underrepresented groups of all types.
And big tech's in a battle the world over with governments and regulators. The government has watered down its online safety bill. Are you happy about that?
Well, firstly, I mean, I think big tech is a broad thing. I mean, it's right.
Oh, you're better than the rest, are you?
No, I'm not saying that, but I think, it's like lumping together everybody who opens a shop and saying all retail's bad, right? Actually, what we should be doing is rightly defining the new rules of the road. Like the pandemic saw what people have called a tech acceleration. We're all using technology more in our everyday lives, and we need to make sure that that's accessible to everyone. But we also need rules of the road. And what the online safety bill is about, similar regulations, actually the ink's dry on the European version of it already, are there to sort of standardise and be clear about the requirements and responsibilities of technology platforms. Now, at Google, we don't wait for the regulation. We try to make sure that we're being responsible and engaged all the way through. But this is an important bill. It will set the standards for the way in which we in the UK get to engage with and access digital technology. So we're really supportive of the aims of the bill, and those aims are about ensuring you and your family are safe online while protecting your privacy and protecting free expression. And
So you're glad
the
it's
devil's in
been
the
watered
detail.
down?
Well, I haven't seen the latest draft. It's gone through multiple iterations. I think there is a concern that the UK bill looks like it's further reaching and more complex than equivalents elsewhere. So we'll have to see the detail.
But people will have, as it stands at the moment, people will have to actively filter out content that they don't want to see. So won't that put vulnerable adults at risk?
Well, let's just step back and look at, if I may, explain a little bit about how we think about sort of content online. And probably the most useful place for me to talk about is YouTube, which we operate. So what we have is a set of laws that tell you what content is illegal and should not be on the platform. The key area of this bill is thinking about what's potentially harmful content that's not illegal. And, our experience is that, firstly, that should not be determined by tech platforms, but governments are also not determining it. So how do you go about deciding? Let me take an example. Violent extremist content. So people talking to cameras about politics, but potentially inciting extremism. How do you define what that is? What we did at YouTube years ago was we consulted with 150 different expert organisations from the Home Office to Europol and so on, and developed policies to try to define in a balanced way where the dividing line should be. Then we trained people to work against those policies to classify videos. And then the key thing is to then be able to use that to train machines. And then we publish our results. So what you have to do is develop policies, have people and machines, and publish your results. And on violent extremism, anytime a video is uploaded to YouTube today that violates that policy, 90% of them are taken down before a single human view. So that shows you how you work through that sort of dynamic.
Yeah.
You always have to keep updating policies because new things come along all the time.
I mean, I looked at your own guidelines, and I know you're saying you've got ahead of the government regulation here, but just before we came on air, I Googled, and I also looked on YouTube at thinspiration videos. I mean, it took me into quite a dark place, I must admit. And for example, I just want to show you one image there. I mean, is that acceptable? You're looking at a skeletal woman there. I mean, there's zillions of these videos on YouTube. There's people glorifying very, very skinny anorexic women. That's not acceptable, is it?
So I would absolutely, looking at that, it doesn't look like a sensible thing for me, but I think you have to ensure that there's a policy that is sensible and balanced around what kind of content is and isn't allowed. I'm not familiar in detail with our policy around that type of video.
Well, let me
I'll
tell you,
certainly take a
because
look
your
at it.
own guidelines on eating disorders say content that praises, glorifies, or encourages viewers to imitate anorexia or other eating disorders characterised by abnormal or disturbed eating habits which negatively affect a person's health. That your own guidelines ban that content. And it was there aplenty in
Right,
YouTube.
so you've shown me a thumbnail of a video which I've not watched, so I can't judge whether that does or doesn't comply with that policy. Our team will have those policies under constant review, and if you and others flag videos, we'll look at whether they do indeed violate those policies. But I think that's something, as I say, these things always need to be under view. That might be content that's sort of taken off recently, and we'll need to look at it responsibly as always. But I can't, I don't want to get into judging an individual video I've not seen sort of live
let me
with
give you another. All I did was tap in. You can see here, I tapped in to Google pro-ana, which is the term used for pro-anorexia content. Just third down the list, Quora says, what are your best pro-ana tips? There's all sorts of tips, totally irresponsible, harmful tips on how to starve yourself. I mean, that was just a quick search before we came on air. And, that contravenes your guidelines, doesn't it?
Well, that's a different thing. You're talking about search results, which are results where we link to content all across the internet. And then YouTube is different. That's hosted videos that people upload. So there are different standards for different types of tools and platforms. And you're right. One of the things that we have to work on with regulators is what's legal and what's illegal. You might say there's a case for some of that content to be deemed illegal in some cases, and that's for governments to do. And that's
Well, is it? What's your view on whether that should be
Well, I
there
think
on your
there's a
platform
difference.
for anybody of any age
Well,
to
let's be
search?
clear, Kathy, that search isn't our platform. It's a tool that searches the entire web, and that's different.
Okay,
We
but
do
we've
try
got
to give,
YouTube as well. I mean, we're dealing with
right,
both
but
of these
let's
issues.
not conflate things, and the devil is in the detail on this stuff. So with search, we're returning results from across the entire web. You can turn on safe search, and we do when we automatically do that when we detect younger audiences or people are signed in. And that's one of the ways in which we try to help people be safe online. But search is about helping you find content across the web. And some of it is distasteful and some of it is illegal and will be taken down. And where content's illegal, it's taken down at the website level.
But just to jump in there, if you are in the grip of anorexia, you're not going to turn on your filters. You're going to be actively looking for that kind of
Right, so
content.
let's talk about how do you help. So you're right, there's content out there that could be dangerous or damaging. There's also content out there that could be helpful. So if you take some of those areas, when people are searching for that kind of harmful comment, both on search and on YouTube, we try to ensure, I haven't seen this result, in general, we try to ensure that there's helpful content at the top. So people in desperate times, we have a partnership where the Samaritans appear with their helpline number and helpful content against that.
And
So
I
that would be
saw
the
that,
aim
I
to do
checked that out as well. And I did notice that most of the results, if you're looking about suicide, most of the results that turned up were to try and steer you away
Yeah.
from taking your life. I wonder then why anorexia is treated so differently, because you just get to, I mean, this is the fourth search down, this Quora thing, which is all sorts of horrible tips for starving yourself. I just wonder how you defend that.
Well, that's a search engine that's searching the entire internet. I agree that you want to make sure that there's a balanced set of results available to people and you're searching on one search term. I think what I'd want to do is look across a range of search terms and see what's turning up. But I think if you go back to what's the role of regulation here, I think what we want to see from the online safety bill is clear responsibilities for platforms that help us to set standards around these things. Our team will constantly look at areas like this, and I'll make sure that we relook again at anorexia as an area to see, is our policy good enough and is our enforcement of that policy good enough? And we will publish our results and should be held accountable for that. And that's what this sort of online safety bill should be doing, is it should be defining standards, asking for codes of conduct, and then verifying that we're performing against those.
But because the government's watered it down, it's now, you have to actively filter out this kind of harmful content.
I mean, again, I think...
Is that right? Would you ask the government to think again on that, to protect people who may be vulnerable?
Well, let's be clear. Firstly, we don't know what the government's done yet because they're going to publish the
No,
detail
they've already
next
said that.
week.
The Culture Secretary has
Well,
said.
they've trailed that, but we haven't seen the detail, and the detail is really important in this area. And what I'm hoping to see is clearer expectations of responsibility. In the European version of this, which we have seen, and the details inked, and it's now in the implementation stage, there's a requirement around responsibility, but not to pre-filter content. And this is one of the key dynamics here, and people are concerned about this. If platforms are required, when users upload content, to filter that content accurately against requirements, it's very, very hard to do that effectively. And there's a worry that if you then find somebody, a very large number, that the risk will be that people just remove everything, and that brings the bad and the good out at the same time, and also
So there's a freedom of speech issue.
Freedom of speech, and many campaigners have been questioning this. So that's why I know it's irritating to you that I'm not, I'm saying, well, it depends on the detail, but it really does. This is a nuanced area. Harmful but illegal content is an area that requires lots of time and effort to research. It's very hard to get it right at scale automatically. I gave you the example of violent extremism. That's taken time to develop policies that really work and can be enforced and developed over time. And the commitment I have is to try to make sure that we're always getting better at this.
Seeing as we've now got into the freedom of speech issue, Kanye West expressed admiration for Hitler on Alex Jones's podcast overnight. Quick Google takes me straight to that podcast. Are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable with that kind of stuff being available to kids, for example?
Well, that is on the internet, and Google search tries to get you the results you want. And I guess there's a case that people want to understand what's been said for themselves, and I do think that's probably a freedom of speech argument. I haven't seen the comments, so I can't comment, on that specific case. But in general, there's probably a category of content that should be available so that people can understand it, but you might not want to be prominent. And that's one of the nuances that you need to think about. When we think about YouTube, we think about sort of 4 ways of dealing with content. We want to raise and reward quality content. So, for example, Times Radio content, genuine journalistic content, accurate content, helpful content. And we want to reduce or remove harmful content, remove illegal content, remove content that violates the policies that we write and try to develop over time, and reduce availability of maybe borderline content where you might argue that there's a freedom of speech or public interest in being able to access something, but it's hurtful or it can cause concern and anxiety. And that's the complexity and the nuance around this kind of discussion.
But what are you doing to stop kids? Because, obviously we can Google that and, interpret it and put it in context and everything. But, some 8-year-old could come across that and you're nurturing potentially a generation of extremists.
Yeah, let's talk more about child safety online, because I think that's a key part of this discussion and debate, and something where we're very aware of our responsibilities. First thing we try to do is create experiences for children. So there's a YouTube Kids, which is very popular, where kids can go and watch videos safely. Second thing we do is build tools for parents. So Family Link is a tool which we build where you can control your children's devices, so determine what sites and apps they can access and how long they can be online for. Third thing we do is other things like Safe Search. You can turn Safe Search on so your children can search. You just gave me some examples of content you wouldn't want your children to see. Turn Safe Search on and it should
But it's all putting the onus on the user, isn't it?
That's right.
And away from you.
No, not at all. We take our responsibility seriously. And I say there are environments which we create specifically for children, and there are tools which we provide for children and parents to safely navigate the web. But it's a bit like the real world, right? In the real world, you can live safely, but you need to, also be careful about what you do. You wouldn't let your child run around central London on their own without knowing how to cross the road. And the same applies here. We've got real responsibilities. We want to give people the tools to deal with that. But then let's think about how you regulate that. So you could say that everybody needs to log into every website and app with their ID. And that's the way you could guarantee age verification on websites.
You in favour of that?
Well, I think that's something for governments to consider, because let's think for a moment about what
But
that web experience
you've
would be
unleashed
like.
this product on the world. Are you personally in favour of that?
Well, let me just talk you through the issues, and then I'll happily sort of talk further about that. So I think that would provide a very different experience of the open, affordable web. And UK citizens, if they were to go to that would start to say, well, hang on, why am I having this? For example, there's 3.5 million UK adults who don't have an ID, like a passport, that would work in that context. What does that do to privacy? And this is where I mentioned that the Act has to balance online safety with privacy. So would you be able to browse incognito? Is it right that you have to log into every website? Do you want that as a society? And that's where the balance starts to come in.
So is it a no
I wouldn't be in favour of blanket age controls like that, because I think the open and affordable web is a valuable tool for everyone, and I think that risks pushing it into a different category. But I do think that we need to be responsible as technology companies. And of course, people need to treat the web just like they treat the real world.
Matt Brittin, we could go on talking for the rest of the show about this, but unfortunately, we have other things to cover, or maybe fortunately. Matt Brittin, President of Google Europe, thank you very much.